Welcome to the World Collective Master Talk Series. Today's guest is Dr. Sweta Chakraborty. She is a risk and behavioral scientist and president of the We Don't Have Time USA group. We Don't Have Time is the world's largest review platform for climate solutions and will be moderated by Sophia Lee. Sophia Lee is an award-winning multimedia journalist, film director, and environmental advocate. Harvard named Sophia one of the top climate communicators of 2022. She was the recipient of the Refinery 29's Sustainable Innovator Award. Today, they will be addressing adapting to sustainable measures and practices in the reality of climate change happening now. They will be discussing our crisis in communication is affecting how we can leverage technology, improve communication on our climate solutions to become a reality.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited here to have Dr. Sweta Chakraborty here with me today. Sweta, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to have this conversation.
Thank you for being here. So, okay, first things first, please explain what We Don't Have Time is beyond just a review platform for climate solutions.
Well, we like to say we're the world's largest review platform and broadcaster of climate content, because we need to make climate conversations the forefront of conversations. Right now, when you interact with your networks, you talk about pop culture and politics. Why isn't the biggest risk that we've ever collectively faced as a global collective being discussed in the same vein? So I wanted to get climate communications to the forefront of people's conversations. So when it became part of the social discourse, then we could actually start to see policy reflect the concerns of the citizens that they are hopefully meaning to look after and take care of. So that, for me as a behavioral scientist and communicator, was really important to be able to contribute how to get climate communications to the forefront so that we could actually get people talking about things that are relevant, that matter, and have policy progress along those really real risks that we face as well. So We Don't Have Time is that platform. I joined We Don't Have Time as initially an advisory board member, and then as a executive board member. And now that we're scaling and we just opened offices in the US, I'm working as their US president. And the idea is to use technology to get climate content to the forefront of people's minds and then to the forefront of political agendas. We're not going to be able to see the many great solutions we have to the climate crisis actually come into reality if we don't have the public pushing for it, and if we don't have policies that support these solutions into reaching commercial viability. These two things reinforce each other. You need public demand and you need policy support. And so that's what the We Don't Have Time platform does. It accelerates climate solutions by sharing good ideas and by scaling those solutions that work. So it really is where we are in terms of being able to use technology to be able to accelerate the solutions. We have the solutions to the climate crisis. We have the solutions. What we have is a crisis in climate, sure, but what we really have is a crisis in communication. Let's leverage technology, improve communication, and see our climate solutions to reality.
Yes, I love all of that. According to the last IPCC report, we have all the climate solutions. We need 10 times more funding and way more storytelling in the space. There's this mind-blowing stat from 2020 that climate was only reported on 0.4% in all of cable news and broadcast, according to Media Matters, which is like mere minutes compared to everything else, which is wild because in 2020, the pandemic was brought upon because of the lack of biodiversity in our ecosystems, and that narrative was completely lost. So I am so fascinated by this and how you ended up here. And I want to know, what is your own climate story? How did you become a behavioral scientist and then fuse that with climate storytelling?
So once you figure out the reality of what's happening in the terms of the planet warming, nothing else takes priority. If you are interested in contributing to bettering society, which a lot of my friends in DC are, it's part of the reason I moved to Washington, because you have a city full of people, and there's other cities like this too. But for me, in terms of proximity from where I'm from, which is New York, and a lot of great things happen in New York, but DC is where kind of the save the world attitude type people go. And so I found myself moving to Washington after finishing my doctorate in behavioral science and thinking, how can I apply this to the most pressing issue. Like, where will this make the most impact? And then once you learn about climate change, it's over. I mean, nothing matters if you can't even go outside without worrying about at what point it's getting dangerous. Nobody's going to care about anything else if they're worried about their children being in the playground too long. And we are actively ushering that really horrific future into reality right now with our really irrational decision making as a public and as policymakers who represent the publics. And so for me, it was really important to apply the discipline of behavioral science, which can be applied to any risk. It can be applied to closing the perception and reality gap when it comes to patient health outcomes, which is what I actually did my doctoral research in, because it's the quirks of our brains that dictate what we care about, what we're going to react to versus what we're going to ignore. And we systematically depart from things that we should care about, what we refer to as rational decision making, and we overreact to things that we shouldn't care about so much. So humans, you'll notice, respond to things like airplane crashes much more than they respond to things like sea level rise. And the reason for that is because the media, policymakers, and people's friends and networks, they pick up on risks that are sensational or really scary or have catastrophic potential. And then the media takes it and just propagates it. Whereas things like sea level rise or heat, we're talking about heat now, summer of 2022, but heat has been a silent killer for decades. It's killed thousands of Americans alone, but it's not a sexy topic to report on in the news. It sounds like just a weather event and people are dying from heat, not a big deal. Now it's a different story, right? Now we've got extreme heat all over the world, but these are the kinds of risks that fall under the radar, the human radar. And it's because of the quirks of our brains. We aren't designed to pay attention to things that really do matter, and we overreact to things that don't. Shark attacks is a good example. People fear shark attacks and they kill in the single digits globally every year. But look at the disproportionate amount of attention that the news provides shark attacks, right? So this is fascinating to me, this gap between perceptions and reality. And that gap matters because it actually informs where our limited resources are going to go. If people are scared of shark attacks and airplane crashes, where do you think our politicians are going to focus the time, attention, money, and resources? And then if we don't care about sea level rise because it's so slow moving, or we don't care about COVID-19 because we're complacent when there's no disease outbreak, something that's invisible, nobody pays attention to, something that's microscopic, right? So we are underprepared and under-responding to and under-reacting to really big risks like infectious disease and sea level rise and ice glaciers melting and all of these things that have serious consequences for human health and security. And we're just not responding to it in the urgency that it requires. How do we begin to change that? We have to close the perception and reality gap. So as a behavioral scientist, I started my career in trying to improve patient outcomes, like why patients don't care about their doctor's instructions. If a doctor is telling a patient to take a pill to control their blood pressure or their cholesterol, why do patients think they know better? Because it's invisible, it's slow moving. You don't feel a heart attack until you feel a heart attack, right? You don't feel the risk factors leading up to it, like high cholesterol and blood pressure. So I thought I was going to apply behavioral science to improving patient outcomes. And then I moved to DC with all my Save the World friends. And I was like, the real issue that I could actually contribute the field of behavioral science to is the climate crisis. We need to aggressively align perceptions to reality. So if we have a fighting chance in being able to allocate resources and policies to addressing the crisis. That was something I really came to realize when I moved to Washington. And I realized we have to prioritize the biggest issues that are affecting us today. And the number one issue is climate change. Nothing else matters if we can't even go outside and safely breathe in air.
Yes. So how have you seen a shift in bridging this gap in perception? Have you seen that shift yet?
So this is what we're doing with the We Don't Have Time platform. It's with young people like you, identifying trusted spokespeople and advocates that can really reach audiences that we haven't been able to reach previously, because you can't just have scientists dumping data on CNN and expecting that's going to then reverberate its way through the US and around the world. And all of a sudden people are going to be clued into the reality of what's happening. And that's not how our brains function. That's not how communications work. You don't want to just top down drop an IPCC report. I'm a scientist. I appreciate the evidence, the data, and the numbers, but the science does not matter. When you are looking to communicate and change people's behaviors, ultimately, you need to and be able to close that perception and reality gap. You have to look at how they are being reached. What vehicles are actually being used to communicate to different audiences, and who are we activating as spokespeople to reach them to? So you can be putting numbers out there till you're blue in the face, which is what scientists have been doing for decades, and we're still more polarized than ever, and we still have an unbelievably disproportionate amount of resources being allocated towards solving this climate crisis. So what does that mean? It's a communications crisis. We need to segment demographics as much as possible, identify groups of people and what factors they have in common, understand the perceptions that exist in those segmented demographics. So, for example, an audience in Wisconsin of middle-aged white males should not be receiving communication the same way that immigrants' daughters in their 20s are receiving information that live in New York City. If we are communicating to these two demographics in the same way, we are doing something very wrong. So we need to take the time to understand what the existing perceptions are across these different groups. What are the mental models is kind of the science jargon for this. Mental models, schemas, call it what you will. There's existing perceptions in different demographics. We need to take the time to identify these perceptions and then strategically custom tailor communications that are relevant to those audiences. Maybe we find out that a population in Wisconsin really does not believe in climate change because they've not experienced anything related to heat yet. They've not experienced anything related to flooding. But what about the Great Lakes warming? That's something that's relevant. Maybe there's a way to actually describe the impacts of climate change in a way that really resonates with that particular audience based on what is urgent and tangible to that audience. We have barely tried to do that. We're barely at the tip of the iceberg and really taking the time to understand existing risk perceptions, creating strategic tailored communications, identifying trusted spokespeople to then disseminate the communications in a way that is going to be received as intended. That's critical. It's one thing to get the information out there. Is it actually being interpreted as the communicator hopes, as the scientist hopes, as you and I as climate advocates hope? How do we know it's being interpreted? Once we know it's being interpreted accurately, then we can begin to predict behavioral outcomes. Then we can say, okay, now this group is going to adapt, is going to actually support policy, is going to be open to proactive preparedness and allocation of funding for engineering solutions, for managed retreat from vulnerable coastlines, whatever it is. But we haven't done that yet. We haven't applied communication science and behavioral science at scale to ensure that we can that people are interpreting the climate crisis correctly and are adapting their behaviors and mitigating against worst case scenarios. So that's really why the communications of solutions are so critical if we're going to see through these solutions to reality.
So what does this mean from a business standpoint? How can businesses best incorporate these behavior science techniques that you're mentioning into sustainable measures for their own company?
That's great. And I talk a lot to businesses on exactly this, because communicators in businesses aren't tasked with anything really beyond information delivery. So this next level of communication, which actually takes the time to map out risk perceptions and to custom tailor communications to be able to not just communicate internally in terms of how to improve operations and make them more sustainable, and to make sure you get the engineers of your company on board, make sure you get the front office, those who are communicating with your stakeholders, whether they're your regulators, whether they're government, whether they are your customers, whether they are not-for-profit groups that are in your ecosystem. There has to be training for communicators, not just within companies, not just to deliver information, but to recognize that they are communicating to different stakeholders internally and externally, and the content of the communication must be adjusted accordingly. You should not be communicating your sustainability within your business or what needs to happen externally the same way to your regulators as you would to your customers. So it's really important to pause and take the time to actually map those perceptions across the different stakeholders to make sure that your communications, again, are interpreted as you're intending. We don't just dump information. We have way too much proof that that doesn't work. Case in point, the lack of movement in solving the climate crisis. That's because all we've done for decades is just tell people numbers and temperature points. And what has that gotten us? So that's the big picture. It's true for communities. It's true for companies. Companies are just a microcosm of larger society. So everything that I'm saying about like the big picture applies down to a single company and their efforts at communication. Companies are also stakeholders in the communities that they are operating in. And multinationals, of course, have a stake across supply chains through the entire globe. So if there was going to be any part of society that had a real vested interest in accelerating climate solutions and applying communication science to accelerating those climate solutions, it's the private sector. So I'm very pleased with where the private sector is going. It's going in the right direction, but it's not going fast enough. We see through our platform incredible rise in awareness and partnership with companies from startup all the way to multinational. But if we're going to see real solutions make their way into reality in time to veer us off this warming trajectory that we're on, that really means no future for the planet, then we need the private sector to come together, to share good ideas, to collaborate, and to communicate in a way that really helps policies support their efforts. And that sounds broad, but it's actually generally very true, regardless of what role the company plays. Broadly, that is the role that the company plays in society.
So let's say I'm a company and I haven't even approached any sustainable measures or communications. Like, how do I first start off that narrative? Do I do the internal work first and then do the communications? Like, what does that look like?
There's 4 steps to this, and it's called the exponential roadmap. And so step 1 is that you have to look at your internal operations first. Make sure before you try to go beyond what you're capable of, step 1 is to ensure that operations internally are sustainable. That's absolutely step 1. And it's called the Exponential Roadmap Initiative. It's a non-for-profit that supports businesses. It's a playbook for businesses that brings that helps businesses keep their operations in line with the global net zero carbon emissions goals. And so we don't reach more than 1.5 degrees Celsius warming by the end of the century. So I highly recommend this. It's completely free to use and download. And they're a partner of We Don't Have Time, our platform. And they are who we like to point as the gold standard for companies. So first is, yes, make sure your internal operations are sustainable. This is followed by looking at your value chain. Is every aspect leading up to your product or service, and then once your product or service is out in society, is that entire process sustainable? It doesn't help if you're building electric cars, but then the steel you're using is still highly carbon intensive, right? So how do you really support others that you work with in the supply chain to ensure that your final product or service is truly aligned to those net zero goals? And then really the step that I'm most fascinated by, the final step in this, is inspiring climate action through society. So we hear about greenwashing a lot, right? We don't want to support any company greenwashing. There's nobody winning in that situation except greedy corporates in the real short term. So there's no greenwashing is just a concept that is like suicidal for everyone involved. But green hushing is equally as bad. And that's something that we don't hear about enough. No pun intended, but we can't hush good climate work. So if companies are taking really solid actions internally, externally, looking at their supply chains, looking at their portfolio companies, really supporting moving to line up with the net zero carbon emissions goals that we've set for ourselves and for the private sector, why isn't that being communicated? We need to be able to communicate so that we, as a company, especially a leader in a sector, is able to inspire other companies within that sector and then more broadly through society. It's a signal that needs to be sent out very consistently and collaboratively across the private sector, but at least within sectors. We need to see aviation come together and say, we might be considered hard to abate, but look, we're going to make it happen. We need to hear it from agriculture. We need to hear it from fashion. I know we're talking about fashion here, and we can, and we're improving all the time. More and more companies and individuals and stakeholders are getting on board with this, but we cannot be quiet about it. We need to share the good work that's underway to help accelerate those who are having challenges, that are trying to figure it out themselves. Give that support. Showcase how you were able to overcome a particularly difficult challenge within your own company as you were moving towards sustainable green operations. Share those challenges. We are not going to put companies to shame or negate the hard work that's going on if companies share the challenges that they're having by pivoting towards clean operations. So no green hushing. Share your good climate work, your good climate actions, and let's inspire society more broadly. That's the final step in the Exponential Roadmap initiative.
Amazing. So no greenwashing, but also no green hushing at the same time. And for fashion companies to actually create a collective and share both their challenges and their progress. Okay, so my last question, Dr. Sweta, is how do you personally stay motivated in this movement, knowing how much work needs to be done?
There really isn't a lot of choice here. There is incredibly smart people across all demographics that, when I'm a millennial. I'm a geriatric millennial is what I've learned recently. That's the term. Geriatric millennial. So I'm one of the first millennials, right? So when I got into this, there wasn't a youth movement the way there is now. So I am constantly being inspired, not just by the people who pulled me in to working on climate, that many of whom are much older than me, many of whom I work with now, my peers that are just incredible people that I know have the right intentions and motivations. It's just so incredible to see the enthusiasm and momentum of the youth coming into this that didn't exist when I started. So I see that this is picking up in terms of priority. It's picking up as a centerpiece of conversation more and more as I put myself out there outside of my bubble, right? Outside of the groups of people that I work with. And I engage and interact with demographics around the world that may have been isolated from a lot of these climate change impacts. And I'm able to do that through We Don't Have Time and the various partnerships that we are building around the world. I'm increasingly being alerted to the fact that there's good people behind this. There's an increasing number of people behind this. And for the most part, aside from bad actors like greedy oil and gas executives, most people do want to do what's right by the planet and for future generations. So it's really a matter of giving people the opportunities to do that, supporting people with different actions that can be taken, right? Not just telling people there's a crisis, but what does that mean? What can you do? That's also behavioral science 101. Don't just scare people. Tell people the truth, which is scary, but then give people hope, give people action steps to take. This is how we're going to collectively mobilize from the youth all the way to geriatric millennials and beyond. And we will be able to solve this crisis because human ingenuity is a stronger force than the planet warming. And I know we will be able to overcome this crisis. We need to move more urgently on it. But together, we're the solution to this.
Yes. And usually what happens in an emergency or a crisis when you're sick, you immediately do everything you can to get better or to resolve the emergency or crisis. And that's what we need to do, is not just be stuck in the paralysis, but actually do our work.
Exactly. I love that. Perfect. Perfectly said.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sweta. It was such a pleasure to hear about the behavioral science and climate and how to approach it. And yeah, thank you for all the work that you do. It's necessary and we don't have time, so it's time.
Right back at you. Thank you for everything you're doing to get this out there too. Appreciate it, Sophia.